Welcome to Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue Series, centering healing advocacy and services. The Elevate Uplift project seeks to deepen and broaden the lessons learned from the National Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative project and engage with organizations to change practices and expand their understanding of healing. Elevate Uplift offers opportunities to help survivor-serving agencies, state, territorial, tribal coalitions, and funding administrators to think critically about how they do their work and to make the changes necessary to provide comprehensive and sustainable support for survivors. That includes establishing practices and services rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression frameworks, learning strategies for building empowering leadership, creating intentional organizational identity, engaging in impactful community organizing and movement building, and expanding knowledge of sexual violence and healing.
Anti-Oppressive Advocacy, exploring the intersection of bias and efficiency. I have to start with this disclaimer notice. My lawyer thinks that it's important. And just to explain that anti-oppressive advocacy in this presentation that I'm presenting today, this training is a component, educational component of this. And this is all of the things that you can or can't do with that. Just have to hold it up long enough so that it can be stated that it is here. There we go. Moving on. I am your host for today, for today's conversation, and a little bit more about who I am, what I do, what I've been doing, what I've been up to. I am, as I stated before, Executive Director of the Swan Center for Advocacy and Research. And I will talk a little bit more about what that looks like on the next slide. But I am also an anti-violence professional who has been in this movement, in this field for the past 15 years. And my work has spanned higher education as well as some community efforts. And I am excited to serve as technical providers for various entities. I'm excited about representing Elevate Uplift Circle of Wisdom as a technical assistance provider in that space. When I am not doing the work of the Swan Center for Advocacy and Research, I am an anti-oppression content expert and coach. And so what that means specifically is that I work with folks whether it's an individual professional or an entire organization who's interested in interrogating the way that anti-Blackness shows up in their professional culture as well as their protocols and procedures. And when I'm not doing that, I'm serving in leadership roles with CAPA as co-founder and right now co-facilitator, and as chair of NASPA's Sexual Relationship Violence Prevention, Education, and Response Knowledge Community. So a little bit more about the Swan Center for Advocacy and Research. I bring you greetings from one of the possible swing states that we are waiting on today to get some election results from Metro Atlanta area. We are a Georgia-based 501c3 that prioritizes survivors of violence who identify as Black and or African American. And our mission statement is, we would like to say pretty simple, but a bit complicated at times, to validate narratives, orchestrate holistic healing, and reduce violence within Black communities. Our work functions from it's a two-armed approach. We provide direct services to those folks within our communities and referral services or crisis line support for those outside of our communities who have been impacted by violence and who are seeking a culturally specific resource center. We provide community outreach and programming, anti-oppression workshops, and we also have signature programming. An example of that is our Mother Wit program, which is a multimedia platform that celebrates the radical love of Black women. This week, we are in the throes of APA 2020, which stands for Anti-Violence Professionals Appreciation Week. The Swan Center thought it was really important to gift the anti-violence field with an appreciation week. We don't have one, and we should, and we often do the work. I often say that anti-violence professionals are some of the first essential workers in the history of our country. And so I think it's important for us to celebrate ourselves. And so that's what we're doing this week as well. A little bit more about the Swan Center. We have 4 foundational understandings. The first is that the anti-violence field was created on the backs of Black women. A lot of the research that I have done in connection with anti-oppressive advocacy is going on the hunt and the search for these Black women that we've all heard about anecdotally. And a portion of this presentation today kind of taps into that as I explain the structure of anti-oppressive advocacy framework today. The second foundational understanding is that we're all compensated on the backs of survivors of violence. Mentors in the field who often remind me that I am a baby in this work often tell me that. It's like, this can be your calling, this can be your ministry, but you're still connected to this work in a way that keeps your lights on. And I think it's really important for us to be reminded of that from time to time. This work often looks like unraveling systems created and sustained by our funders. Can't get any more clearer than that. And so I'll go to the last point. Anti-Black racism is so globally rampant that other races of the world are judged by their proximity to or away from Blackness. So these are these guiding statements and foundational understandings that keep us pointed in the direction of liberation for all through the prioritization of Black survivors. So some community agreements today. I know that this is an opportunity, I would love for this to be an opportunity for us to have some innovative and interactive conversations. What is said here stays here. What is learned here leaves here. That discomfort, I ask that you sit in it for a minute. There may be some conversations that come up today that will be uncomfortable for you. And a lot of it is stemmed in how we see ourselves coming to this work and the ways in which we ignore, can't see, or work around the very true statement that our field is not at all outside of the danger zone as it relates to creating systems that add to or that sustain white supremacy and white comfort. We're going to get into that a little bit today, but I ask that you, instead of leaning away when you feel some discomfort today, I'm going to ask you to lean into it. I'm going to ask you to lean right into it. And I want you to also interrogate within yourself where this tension is sitting, why it's sitting there. For what reason, and what value system is this rubbing up against, and what is that specific value system steeped in? I'm also asking you to take care of yourself. If at any point where you feel that this is a conversation that you need to disassociate or step away from, I ask that you do so, and I ask that you come back to the space when you feel that it is safe for you to do so. Own your isms, you gotta own your stuff. And I want you, again, sit in it and understand that if you are coming into this space, I want you to come into this space with an opportunity to learn, with an opportunity to, with an openness to taking in new information. And that also means owning your stuff. And I want you to practice moving up and moving back. There will be a point where we will be utilizing our chat systems. We're going to be utilizing our asking questions. If you find yourself being very, very overly present today, I'm going to ask that you regulate yourself. And if there's something that you want to say, but you don't feel that you can say, I'm going to ask that you step back. That you step up. Some of the learning outcomes to expect today is an increased understanding of how the overarching systems and field-specific training that we've had develop problematic approaches to the anti-violence field. Also understanding how the role and the history of anti-Blackness served as a backdrop in support of this and resulted in inequitable care for Black survivors of violence. And last but not least, I want us to think about developing and hopefully developing organizational strategies to identify and shift from a non-racist to anti-racist perspectives. Some general housekeeping rules for today is that it feels lecture-based. And this is, as I stated briefly earlier, Anti-Oppressive Advocacy Framework. This particular training is more of an introduction. I took 7 years of research and I worked really, really hard to kind of cram it into this presentation today. This is more of an introduction into some larger iterations of how anti-oppressive advocacy as a framework can be studied and provided in some other ways. Anti-oppressive advocacy is a larger training series. There's also an online educational course, a 4-month course, and it honestly, it varies. There will be writing prompts today and reflection prompts today. And so I ask that you grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, and again, please regulate your self-care. If there are any questions that come up today that I'm not able to get to, I have provided my email at the end of this presentation, and I love emails from people who have questions about this framework. So please feel free to use it. Email is completely fine. All right, let's get started with naming our work culture with a specific focus on the nuts, bolts, and roots of this whole operation. Remember that time that I said we were going to do reflection prompts? Here we are. So I am going to ask a series of short questions. I want you all to answer in bullet point fashion. I'm not asking you to do too big or too deep a dive. Just what's there on the surface, what comes up, comes out. Okay, so we're gonna get started. And the first question is simply, what actions have you taken to unravel oppression today within your organization? I want you to just do some really quick bullet points. What actions have you taken today to unravel oppression within your organization? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer that. Okay. So we're going to move on to the next question, and I feel compelled to say that I have some happy hooligans in my house. That's what I call my dogs. They are part of the Happy Hooligan Gang, and you may hear them. As we all know, this is what happens in a pandemic.
Wanda,
yes.
Can we switch real quick so the interpreters can swap?
Yep, sounds good. Perfect, thank you.
I think we should be good, thanks.
Not a problem. All right, so the second question is, what did you do yesterday to unravel oppression within your community? I'm going to give you 30 seconds with that, starting now. Okay. Next question. When was the last time you spoke out against statements rooted in anti-Blackness? You have 30 seconds for that, starting now. Okay. Next question. How do you ensure that your work specifically supports Black survivors of violence? I'm going to give you 30 seconds as well, starting now. Okay. Now, I will never ask you what you wrote down. Never, because I think that that is none of my business, actually. But I am interested in how what you wrote made you feel. And so I'm wondering if I could get some folks in the chat to just kind of jot down how your answers to these questions made you feel. What are some things that came up for you? And I will open up my chat to see if we can get some answers to that. Okay. Feeling heavy in my white privilege. Feeling like I'm reaching, nothing feels like enough. Okay. looking at this and definitely feeling like I'm not doing enough. Nervousness, yeah, that makes complete sense. It was more talk and reading as opposed to action. That's a really good tangible. Yeah, there's life happening outside my window today, y'all. I'll tell you. Sorry about that. That's really tangible, Megan. As a Black woman, sometimes I have to reflect on the times where I'm not engaging, on the times it doesn't always have to be me. It's a really good piece to bring into the space also. Thank you. Both positively and negatively, recognition that there are some actions that I have taken and do take regularly, but others that I don't. Okay. And then lastly, someone said that their answers made them feel a bit disappointed in themselves. And been aware that they're not doing enough, but these questions revealed how little they're doing and that they need to do better. Thank you all for that. Thank you for your vulnerability in this space. I think that, the work that we're doing is work that we're able to explain to other people every day as to why it is so important. But I think that when we are having to dig down into the specifics and also specifically what it means to connect with and do the work of supporting some of our most marginalized folks, I think is really hard. And I think that there is a gap in the understanding of the work that we're doing and understanding where that work is landing and who's actually being served. And so I thank you all for this. And I want you to hold on to that, to these answers, these feelings as we move through this. And like I said, I want you all to lean into this discomfort, right? And I want you to tap into how we got here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Well, see, told you, wouldn't lie to you. Okay, let's put these pieces together. And we cannot talk about, and I think it's so timely, we can't talk about this work without talking about anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And so I took the liberty of defining it, getting some definitions to it, because one of the things that I often find that is interesting is that we're also a group of people who do this work and who want to unravel anti-Blackness, but we usually don't have a working definition that allows us the opportunity to kind of dig into what this means. And so I have two definitions here. So we'll start with the Movement for Black Lives' definition. They define anti-Blackness as a two-part formation that both voice Blackness of value while systemically marginalizing those visible or perceived to be Black people and their issues. The Swan Center wanted to flesh this out a little bit more. And so we have continued with this definition and included that anti-Blackness is a specific type of racial prejudice that presents as resistance, hostility, exclusion, and or antagonism towards those perceived to be Black in a direct and or indirect manner. And direct manners looks like physical brutality and assault. Indirect manners can look like legislation that reduces equity and or completely removes rights of folks. Anti-Black racism is the fulcrum of white supremacy. So Scott Nakagawa in 2012, an activist, wrote an article, a post, and he uses that to explain why he leans more into unraveling anti-Black racism. In the article, he talks a lot about how he starts it off by saying that, as an Asian man, he often gets asked, like, why aren't you doing more work for your people? Why are you so concerned with anti-Black racism? Like, why is that your thing? What are you doing? And his response was like, because anti-Blackness is the fulcrum of white supremacy. If we don't understand that, then none of us will ever be free, right? And so I included this little bit of a graphic here to help you understand it. What Nakagawa says is that within the United States, if we're talking about race and this idea of racial arrangement, there is technically no bottom, and that at any point, different groups of people have the ability to affect others, and our roles are not necessarily fixed, but there is a group of folks in this country who are designated as a force, a laboring force, one that supplies capability for action, right? And it is this group that acts as the fulcrum where the ideals and the actions that support and sustain white supremacy are hoisted from, right? And so while there is no bottom, there is a binary, right? And that binary comes at the expense of Black folks acting, of anti-Blackness acting as the fulcrum, as that one bit of space and object and force that allows action to be propelled from it, right? And so I think that that's a really important piece to keep in mind as we work to try to bring this intangible piece of anti-Black racism to a more tangible space, right? And so we also can't do that without talking about whiteness. And so, as I stated earlier in my presentation, there are my work as an anti-oppression coach is one where I'm usually talking to white people a lot, all day. And I am either helping them as through an executive coaching space or through some organizational restructuring. And a lot of that work begins with me having to explain the difference between white as a construct, white as a racial marker, and white supremacy, and how those three are married, but how they are not the same. And so I wanted to just bring a piece of that to this presentation today, and to provide a little bit of a history lesson. White as a racial identifier was not a thing until around the 17th and 18th century in this country, or what will eventually be the United States, right? And it was a construct that was created after one of the country's earliest examples of an uprising. And so, unbeknownst to a lot of folks, there were free people of color in the colonies before slavery. And these folks, along with free European folks, were here to work off debts, and they, were working from a space of indentured servitude. And there wasn't a racial dynamic in the way that we see it, the way that we know that will happen shortly after. And so these were folks who were working side by side, working together, saw themselves as equal. And there was an issue that happened around workers' rights. And that led to what was known as Bacon's Rebellion. And that is where we saw these folks of African descent and these folks of European descent working together to overthrow the folks who created the structure of indentured servitude. And though they were not successful, they created enough of a mess to scare those folks who were in control to say, oh, we got to do something here. Like, this is not at all what we need. We need people to keep working, and we need to benefit from it. So how in the world can we do this? And so that is when this idea of this construction of races, of whiteness specifically, showed up. And that is where, honestly, I think my research explained that actually Blackness was created before whiteness. And so, and Tracy McMillan Cottom says in her 2019 book of essays, Thick, she is defining whiteness along those terms as well. Whiteness exists as a response to Blackness. It is a violent sociocultural regime legitimized by property to always make clear who's Black by fastidiously delineating who's ultimately white. Teresa Guest takes it up in her work that she published in 2006. Whiteness is a socially significant structure that mitigates life chances in American society, and it includes America's history of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and discrimination based on the ascription of some measure of social devaluation imposed on non-white peoples and normatively defined racial characteristics. And so whiteness as a construct is what we know as this driving force that birthed this narrative of a default race, right? And branded these ideals of white superiority as being the law of the land. And so when I'm having these conversations with my clients, a lot of I'm very straightforward, and the work is simply, the goal is to dismantle whiteness as a construct. That does not mean that I want to, and that includes separating the difference between whiteness as a construct and whiteness as a race. And so we're going to take a break right now. I see Carla has popped up. So we're going to give the interpreters a few minutes to switch out, and then we will continue.
I think they only need like 30 seconds. Just
awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you. All righty, good to go. So we will be moving on. So what we know is that the messages that evolve from white supremacy, from this idea of whiteness as a default, we are born into it. We're born under it. We breathe it in, and it sends us messages about who we are, who we're not, who people who look like us are, who they're not. It gives us messages about what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be non-white? What does it mean to be LGBTQ? What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to belong in this country? What does it mean to have bodily autonomy? And how negotiable are civil and equitable rights? But the other thing that it does is that it creates and maps out various levels of oppression. And so we're talking about the 4 I's of oppression right now. And so what we know is that ideological oppression that exists under this umbrella of white supremacy is the form of oppression that supports a dominant group's belief in superiority, and also supports a dominant group's belief in who is inferior. And we know that those messages seep into our institutions. They seep into our schools. They seep into our media presentation. They seep into our politics. They seep into our equitable practices. They seep into our law enforcement systems and our education. We know that. And that creates, that creates interpersonal oppression, right? And what that means is now it creates an opportunity where members of the dominant group feel emboldened to harm, harass, mistreat other folks. And what oppression does for those who are members of the non-dominant group is it creates spaces where it sends messages about who they are and who they're not. And so you either have folks who are internalizing it and are working to, and this is something that Tressie McMillan Cotton says in her book, to fix their feet, right? To work to mimic patterns or different practices of whiteness, right? To be considered more human. Like that's where we are, right? Because we know that white supremacy is a dehumanizing concept. And what it also does is it creates spaces where those same messages that are used to disenfranchise those non-dominant groups are now messages that those non-dominant groups use to disenfranchise each other. So colorism is an example of that, right? All right, I promise you some reflective writing again, okay? I want you all to take a minute and a half now. I'm gonna give you a little bit more time. And I want you to focus specifically on these two questions. So I want you to, oh, I think that someone's mic isn't muted. So the first question is, how may these messages that you just learned, that for us doing this work we know about, but how may these messages show up in your work? And I want you to take a minute and 30 seconds to just jot down bullet points. Well, we'll take a minute. How may these messages show up in your work? And I am going to time it because I don't trust myself. So we're going to start now. How may these messages show up in your work? Oh, it's not a problem, Carla. Thank you. Not a problem. Okay. We're going to take another minute. I want you to answer the next question. How may these messages impact how you validate the experiences of Black survivors? Starting now. How may these messages impact how you validate the experiences of Black survivors? Okay. All right. So similar to how we did this before, again, I never ask you what you wrote. I just am wondering how what you wrote made you feel. So if you feel so inclined to share, again, please feel free to do so. Okay. So if those, we have some that's coming in. Hard to describe, but I want to work harder to make sure that Black survivors can be soft. Oh, Shamika, that explain to me, can you just give a few extra words? I know exactly what you mean when you say that, but can you give a few extra words of what that means when you say Black survivors can be soft? And I thank you. I thank you for using that language today. That's so important. Black people, Black women have to be tough constantly. Yes. Yes. No room for frailty, fragility, soft feelings, softness, vulnerability, right? There's no room. There's no space for it. It is Black women's bodies, Black folks' bodies in general become these productions of action, right? And there is no looking back, and there is no room for anything that feels soft. I thank you for adding that to this conversation today. And I think that's really important. I think that that's a question that I want you all to take with you today. Like, are you creating spaces where Black folks can come in and unburden and unpack and feel soft in your spaces? I want to talk a little bit about that as we move on, but I thank you so much for adding that. I think that's very important. Okay, we're going to move on through the training now. If there are some other points that you all want to give in the space, please feel free to do so. You don't have to, but I thank you. Are we getting ready to switch out?
Yep.
All right.
Final
30 seconds,
switch.
y'all. Final switch. And there are my dogs going. Thank you. Good to go. Y'all, when they start barking like that in succession, they're no longer happy hooligans. I now call them hellhounds. So, oppressive advocacy is our baseline. So now we need to talk about our professional origin story. And I cannot talk about it without talking about cultural competence. Y'all, I don't know if you heard, but feel free to spread this around to anybody that you know. Wanda Swan thinks cultural competency trainings are trash, okay? One of the ways I think that our field does the work of courting and sustaining white supremacy is by creating mechanisms that sustain white comfort. And I think there is no other definition or no other example that better describes that than our use of cultural competency trainings. And we all know, like, we all do it, we've all done it. And it is these trainings that allow us to teach us to be tolerant of other people's cultural differences, and then it's an opportunity for folks to gain knowledge about these cultural practices, and then you have to promise to like do better, like try harder, right? Very surface level. The issue that I have with cultural competency is the same issue that I have when I take a Cosmo test. It is all based on self-assessment. And as we know, we are not going to skew ourselves. We are not going to skew the work so that we look bad. Like, the work is to ensure that we look good. And I think that same concept is applied to cultural competency. And so cultural competency is trash because it is something that white people specifically can do in the comfort of their own home with a book about other people's culture. There are other instances where we've seen this happen, whether we're talking about mission group, mission trips, things of that nature. The reason why it does a disservice to marginalized folks, specifically Black folks in particular, is because cultural competency training never allows white people to sit in a space of learner. White comfort ensures that white folks will always sit as expert, even in lived experiences that they don't know. And that's what cultural competency courts. It courts that because of white fragility. And so I think that there are definitely there's other ways that this happens, but I think that what this ultimately gives us or points us in a direction to is some oppressive approaches to what is known as anti-violence work. And some of the ways in which we harm Black folks is because of these types of trainings and this dedication to white comfort is this assuming that Blackness is a monolith, right? Providing support or education that is colorblind and only unites folks under the title of survivor, which, as we know, especially in higher education and beyond, is a default. When we're talking about survivor support, is usually a very default. It's a default survivor profile, and that default survivor profile is usually white. When we use wording specific to Black experiences in a wider scope, an example of this is intersectionality, right? Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw tells folks all the time that white folks are using that word wrong, and it's not specifically meant to talk through the experiences that all folks have when we're talking about this idea of intersection of identities. It was specifically created, cultivated research to talk about Black women's experiences with sitting at the intersection of racism and sexism in a very different way. There are also assumptions made about services and what community looks like, right? That's based on these preconceived notions and bias around who is a community and what does that mean? Who is family and why does your family look like that? And your family looks different from other, why are these people living in your house, right? What is your family? What does that mean, right? Not wanting to be caught learning. Oppressive approaches to anti-violence work often means not wanting to be caught learning, not wanting to be put in a space or in a persona of someone who's learning or student, right? You always have to be the expert. And I said this earlier today with a client, like, white people don't like to be a white person in the room with other white people and not know or not be the expert, because there is a part of it, of whiteness, where you have to continue to be, and what white supremacy tells you is that you have to continue to be the best, the one, the leader. And that even means that if you're in spaces with other folks who look like you, the last thing you want to do is to not be the expert over the other quote unquote experts. I think one of the biggest disservices that oppressive approaches do to anti-violence work, though, is this idea of compartmentalizing these various identities as separate pieces that aren't impacted by violence. And I think that that is something that our work, our field has to give into account to. The anti-violence field is a field that was built on the backs of Black women. And this was all about the large tents, right? So it's not looking at all these separate pieces and digging out these separate pieces. And I don't actually want to talk about that. So I'm not going to address this. We're actually going to address these things that you came in to talk about today. Well, that also sustains white comfort, because if you're uncomfortable talking about it, you're not gonna support that. You're not gonna support that survivor in that way. I think one of the things that you have to understand is that whatever organization that you are representing today, it's important that you know that Black survivors and community partners have already compartmentalized and categorized who you are and whether you're friend or foe, because this is something that Black folks have to do every day, everywhere we are, at every moment of the day. And I think that that is no more truthful than what we see right now. We're in the middle of one of the biggest elections of our lives. And the results are neck and neck. And it is that way because there is an understanding that there are folks in this country who are just not interested in Black survival at all. And I think the numbers show that. And so what Black folks do, what we've always been doing, what we've been doing when we're not saving the country, or we're not saving white people from themselves, we do the work of trying to find our own coping mechanisms and our own strategies within our own communities. And when we're constantly tapping into that, constantly doing the work of trying to bandage our stuff and take care of ourselves while we're hurting and while we're supporting other people, we are not okay. And we are drastically underserved. And so we have to operate under one big tent. And so in 2017, after probably like 4 years of research, I was like, this is where we are. Anti-oppressive advocacy. This is a definition that I feel comfortable going forward with, right? Anti-oppressive advocacy is service provision by social justice agents that actively serves to unravel institutional and external oppression that impacts historically marginalized people and communities. What that means simply is that we are having to adapt a system that automatically goes against what we have been trained to do in this work. This work was built on the backs of Black women. I've said that several times during this presentation. And the research that I have worked for the last 7 years has been research that allowed me to identify those Black women, to talk about why their contributions to this work has been outstanding, but also anti-oppressive advocacy as a framework within itself is a framework that is steeped in Black feminist abolitionism. And what we know about Black feminist abolitionism that occurred in this country around the 17th century is that this was a type of framework that saw sexual violence, racism, housing inequities, police brutality as all one big tent. Reproductive justice, we're all this one big tent. And what we know is that over time, this work got co-opted, and it got co-opted by folks who were not interested in taking on all of these pieces. And so this idea of the Black feminist abolitionism as a framework to reducing instances of violence and oppression, they became parts of that got pulled out. And it got pulled out specifically because if I'm a white woman and I'm doing this work, and yes, I want to stop sexual violence, but that don't mean I want Black people to live next to me. So I'm not going to talk about housing equity. If I'm a white woman and I'm doing this work and I really want to end DV, but I don't really know how to specifically get over my view of Black folks as not being completely human. So I don't want to talk about racism. I just want to handle sexual assault or DV, right? And so what anti-oppressive advocacy requires of you, and I've broken it down into two pieces. For one, it requires that you be an ally. And if you're like me and you're so sick of hearing this word, I know I am too, But I think it's important for us to understand that being an ally means that you understand what oppressive systems you perpetuate. It is not about how many pink pussy hats you got. It is not about how many Black Lives Matter signs you have in your yard. It is understanding what oppressive systems you perpetuate and how you can be harmful even in your attempt to heal. And so there are some things that you have to do on an individual level to ensure that you are actually being an ally. And so that looks like, one, interrogating your deeply rooted belief systems and traditions. What value systems do you hold that are anti-Black in its origin? What stereotypical narratives around Blackness do you still find believable? Right? Thomas Jefferson wrote and believed for quite some time that Black people could not feel pain. He wrote that in a book. That book got published. And that book, that note, impacted greatly now, today, how our medical field treats and supports Black pregnant women, supports Black folks who are in great pain and are in need of quote unquote narcotics, and it criminalizes Black folks and renders their expertise of their lived experiences as invalid, right? What systems are you upholding personally and professionally that are harmful to Black people? And how white is your world? These are some things I want you to think about. Barnard says that all white people possess one of these 8 identities. What white identity do you possess? Where are you sitting in this space? And where would you like to be? Again, when I'm working with clients, this is also one of the models that I use, where we are really trying to figure out what type of races are you? And then where would you like to be? And I say that because we have to understand that if we are all living and breathing under a culture of whiteness, under a construct of whiteness, and we all get very different messages and we get treated differently based on the messages that we receive, we believe those messages. And if those messages are steeped in racism, that means that we believe racist messages. And that means that we're also racist, right? The second step is being an accomplice. And that means to actively dismantle white supremacist culture, right? And that is the external work. I'm not personally looking for an ally. I appreciate folks who are doing their work, but I want folks to be ready to be an accomplice. And I want people to understand that dismantling the construct of whiteness is going to be the only thing that frees us all, because it's not real. And it was solely constructed for the purposes of ensuring that there would be one class of folks who will forever be treated unfairly and discriminated against. And that's it. There had to be a working class of people. Whiteness is not a coincidence, it is a strategy. Okay? So some things to take with you as we get ready to wrap up, some things as you're looking at what does this mean for my organization, some questions that you can ask is, what institutional commitments to anti-oppression are written down or spoken? What accountability structures dedicated to dismantling anti-Blackness are present, critiqued, or reviewed? What assessments are done to measure the culture created and sustained? This is a framework to think about. Multicultural organizational development framework is a framework that identifies 6 stages of institutional presence that ranges from those that are strictly strictly monocultural to polycultural, right? So adapting a multicultural approach within your organization. Does your organization see white as the default? Right? I used to work for an organization that before this year, Juneteenth wasn't really a thing for a lot of folks. And I've been celebrating Juneteenth since before I can remember, and I used to take the day off. And I remember having to explain to my white boss why Juneteenth is a thing. It's not on the calendar. It's not a thing that I've heard of. So what is it, and why are you celebrating it? You know? So that is an example of a cultural organization that is looking at whiteness as a default. I will end with this quote. It's one of my favorites. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is a commitment to fighting racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. It's the only way forward.
You've been listening and viewing Elevate Uplift's Community Dialogue series. Elevate Uplift is supported by a collective of national organizations and Circle of Wisdom members leading anti-sexual violence work and includes the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Resource Sharing Project, and our Circle of Wisdom members who provide us with direction, expertise, connections, and influence. For more information, please visit www.elevateuplift.org.